This segment of My Conversation is brought to you by Aspect Ministries, effective 21st century faith.
Good morning and welcome to My Conversation. My name is Jason Hurst on the TV show that takes place 11 and 11:30 on Sunday mornings. Hey, Merry Christmas, everybody. Come on now. Michael Bogart is here once again, a sponsor of the show from Aspect Ministries, talking about the reason for the season.
Yes, sir.
Always a pleasure to have you on the show. Always learning something new, that's for sure.
Great to be here, Jason, and Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you very much. So what's going on today?
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about the human side of what Christians call the incarnation or the Christmas story, the birth of Christ.
Okay.
And so, a lot of times, if you're sitting in church or you go to a service or somebody in the family reads the passages out of Luke and Matthew that talk about the birth of Christ, you sort of breeze over the story and it doesn't really sink in what happened on the human side of that for Mary and Joseph. I mean, they're the people that had to live with the consequences of this.
Must have been weird.
Oh, you'd think
but
so.
But honorable, too.
Well, yeah. And so, let's start with Mary. Her account is in the Gospel of Luke. Luke focuses on Mary's story. And so Mary is a young woman who is betrothed to be married. She's betrothed to Joseph.
And how old is she?
Well, don't know exactly, but chances are she's somewhere between 13 and 16 years old. So
for them it was like right on the age, right?
Yeah, that would be about the time that most young Jewish girls of that time, entered marriage. And so her family probably helped arrange this marriage. Joseph seems to have been somewhat older, maybe in his 20s or 30s. Right. Don't know exactly. But, like any young woman who's, married, she's looking forward to marriage. She's looking forward to running her own house, to having children, to being, with this guy that she obviously at least respects if she doesn't love him, because she could have rejected the whole thing, And so right in the middle of that, or right as she's getting prepared for marriage, this angel, Gabriel, appears to her, which, if that's not frightening enough, tells her that her whole marriage plans basically are going out the window. Right. I mean, that's the implications of what he's saying to her.
That must have been wild.
Yeah, I mean, you are going to be with child, assuming that she said yes, and she did. She said, Lord, let it be to me as you have said. So that means she agreed. But maybe afterwards, I'm thinking it dawned on her.
Right.
This marriage isn't happening now.
Oh, wow.
What am I going to tell Joseph? What am I going to tell my parents? What am I going to tell my friends? She's pregnant. Obviously, in those days, in that circumstance, pregnant like that just didn't work.
Yeah.
So she doesn't know what she's facing. My contention is that one of the big faith stories of the Bible happens at that moment with Mary of Nazareth.
Could she have said no to the whole thing?
I think, humanly speaking, she had every ability to say no if she wanted to. Now, God obviously looks into the future and kind of knows what you're going to say, but at the same time, she could have derailed the process, at least with her.
I wonder what was going through her head.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I'm sure she was bewildered. I'm sure she was, overcome by the experience. But then you think about poor Joseph. You go back to Matthew, which is Joseph's story. And apparently God, in his wisdom, saw fit to let Matthew stew for a while.
Okay.
Because he finds out Mary's pregnant. Whether she told him or whether he figured it out or somebody else told him, we don't know.
Right.
But he's deciding what to do about it. I mean, he can't go through with the marriage. Mm-hmm. So whether he's going to do it publicly and play the victim and be outraged, or whether he's going to do it privately is really what he's deciding.
And what are people thinking at this point, too?
Well, yeah, and the neighbors are starting to talk, and Joseph decides he's going to do the private thing. He's going to be very quiet about it. He's not going to make a public spectacle out of it, but he can't see going through with the marriage. In fact, you got to think, Joseph probably thought, how could I have misjudged her? I mean, this is the furthest thing that I would have expected from somebody like her.
So you're saying he wanted to back out of it, maybe?
He did clearly want to back out of it.
Right on.
And then it took the same angel, at whatever point that was, some months into the pregnancy, to visit Joseph and give him the message from God that, don't be afraid to take her as your wife. Okay. This child is the Son of God.
A little affirmation is good from God.
Well, yeah. And of course, then Joseph jumps right into action, and the whole thing goes through, and then the Bethlehem story happens, and all of that. But in my mind, those two people, Mary and Joseph, don't get nearly enough credit for the faith that they exercised.
Oh, absolutely.
To make it possible for God to bless us with His presence in the world and what he did on the cross.
As time goes on, people have to get more comfortable with it, seeing it happen before their eyes, right? I mean, they got to get more comfortable as soon as they see more progress with it, know it's real.
Exactly right, exactly right. And you know, I think Mary and Joseph went through some of that, where it took a while for it to sink in. I mean, how can something that huge be comprehended immediately?
Right.
In fact, later on, it says Mary and Joseph didn't quite understand this kid that they were raising. I mean, you know,
Did they know it was God?
Well, they should have known because they were told, but you know how it is.
I'm sure there's like these human doubts that go on throughout life. They kind of go like, I think it is, I was told that, but is it really?
Well, you know, remember that time when Jesus was 12 and he got separated from the family. They'd been up to Jerusalem for a feast, and the family went on home, and they realized Jesus wasn't with any of the relatives. And they finally found him back in Jerusalem at the temple, and he said to them, "Didn't you know I'd be in my Father's house about my Father's business?" It's almost like he had to remind them, you should have known where I would have been.
He was cool with it. Why weren't they?
Yeah. So, I mean, you get these little hints that they needed to be reminded over time that this really was happening.
Isn't that kind of life, though? We kind of go through life and kind of progress and learn about God more, and our faith grows through it.
Well, yeah, and you always have to, you know, people have to remind you, or you have to remind yourself, you know what God did for you 2 years ago? Do you think he's any less powerful now?
Right.
Any less wise now? And so it gives you the strength to trust for the future.
Man, time is flying on by. In fact, we've got to wrap things up, so tell us how to get a hold of you.
Well, I've got a series called The Drama of the Christmas Story. It's one of the blogs on my website, aspectministries.com. You can go and get the whole thing there. Merry Christmas. It's my gift to you.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Always love talking about the reason for the season, of course. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure.
We'll be back. Stick around.
This segment of My Conversation is brought to you by Aspect Ministries, effective 21st century faith.